the topic of business continuity planning, and which is a topic that many of us have heard of and are a bit familiar with, but during the current pandemic have realized that we didn't have flexible and helpful and practical business continuity plans in place. So this toolkit was created to help you think about that topic and then do something about it and really help you get ready for the next interruption to your normal operations. And again, funding and support for the development of the toolkit was provided by Duke Energy. If you go to nonprofitrisk.org, you'll also find additional resources on crisis management, crisis communications, COVID-19, resumption strategies, and so forth, including our newsletter, which is called Risk Management Essentials. You'll also find issues of our e-news, books, so forth. Lots and lots of resources that are easy to access on nonprofitrisk.org. And if you're a member of the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, you're also a member of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, and there's no extra cost for that. And so I do urge you to consider setting up an affiliate login so you can quickly access all of those resources on many different risk topics. Super easy to create that login. Just follow the steps on the website. And if you want to ask a question about resumption, about crisis communications, crisis management, business continuity planning, or really any risk issue whatsoever, please feel free to reach me directly at the email address and phone number on the first and last slide. But you can also fill out the risk help form that you'll find on our website. So whatever's easiest for you. It's certainly great to hear from people who take the time to call, but an individual email or a completed form is fine as well, whatever works for you. And finally, just to let you know that this morning we published an article on Resume and Thrive strategies. I'm going to be talking about them today, but if you want that article to share with others in that written format, you can download that from the Risky News page, which is under the Resources tab at nonprofitrisk.org. All right, let's get into what does new normal mean for your organization? So the expression, the only constant is change, has been attributed to Heraclitus, who was actually a Greek philosopher. And his words apparently were, change is the only constant in life. But as I thought about change and kind of this phase as we go back to our working environments in the weeks and months ahead, I realized that not all changes affect us in the same way. So you might be familiar with the concept that we tend to feel safer when we're in control. And a great example of this is driving. And I'm wondering how many of you feel much safer as a driver versus when you're a passenger, when you're seated next to the driver. And in my own experience, I found that that's true even when I know that the person driving is safe and reliable and has an excellent driving record. So most people feel that way. We tend to feel more nervous when we don't have our hands on the wheel. And I think that the same is really true in terms of change. And I was thinking back to my childhood and how upset my older sister was when we moved from New York to Massachusetts when we were in elementary school. And, not surprisingly, she wasn't the slightest bit upset when she later made a move from California to Virginia as an adult. And I think that part of the reason that she wasn't upset as an adult was that she had control and choice. It was her choice to move from one state to another, and she was fully in charge of that move. Whereas as a child, she had no control whatsoever. Changes that we choose to make and changes that sneak up on us are often a bit easier to accept, but sudden changes like reorganizations that we had no idea were coming, or the accidental death of a loved one, or the implications of COVID-19, and it kind of fall into this third category of changes that sweep us off our feet, and these are the hardest to accept. So although the only constant is change, change is not the same from one instance to the next, and there are different types of changes. So I was thinking a little bit about this concept of a new normal and started with some of the more sobering facets of this new normal for individuals and for our organizations. And it occurred to me that, many of us are dealing with the death of a beloved colleague or client, or will be. We're facing the elimination of beloved programs or services that our organizations have offered for a long time. We're facing the departure of colleagues who perhaps some have retired, but others have been downsized or laid off or furloughed. And we're also facing, in many cases, the loss of financial good health and the financial stability that many organizations were experiencing at the end of last year and looking forward to for this coming year. And then finally, we're also facing increased workloads and a sense of burden and burnout. And some of that is due to the fact that we're juggling families in addition to work since schools have been closed. And so many different responsibilities on our shoulders. But as I thought about the sobering aspects or facets of a new normal, I also started to think about the hopeful aspects, and I wanted to share some of those. And these are kind of a corollary to the downsides of the new normal. And I started jotting down some words that came to mind, and I quickly saw that I almost formed a word. And with a few tweaks, I was able to come up with the word grateful, which really captures how I'm feeling. Um, First is gratitude for every stakeholder who's reached out to say, "How are you doing? Um, is there anything I can do to support you?" I've heard from so many colleagues that I hadn't spoken to or exchanged emails with in many, many months, in some cases, many years. Another word that comes to mind is resilience. I've said this quite a few times in my career that resilience DNA is built into nonprofit missions. We're kind of built to survive. I think part of that is because we have these strong and vast stakeholder networks that come to our rescue when we need them. The third word that came to mind was awe. I think it's incredible how hard people are willing to work despite all of the pressures of family and the anxiety that's been associated with COVID-19. Then I thought about teams and realized that, very few things can be accomplished alone. And although sometimes a task or project can be completed faster when I work alone, I can always go much further and be more successful when I work in a team. And then E reminded me of evidence that we're hearing and seeing so many testimonials of the impact of nonprofit organizations. And I think that's really powerful. Um, Faith is that turns out we're more nimble and creative than many of us thought were possible, and that's led to some understanding. And for me, understanding has come in the form of realizing that trying to force people to fit into one person's view of a work culture isn't really leadership at all. And we need to be more understanding and kind and patient, but we need to take those moments to just say, wait a second, this is not what I thought it was going to be. And that leads us to learning, which is, with so much uncertainty, I think the opportunities to learn are almost endless. And I just would challenge you to make sure you're jotting down some of the lessons that you're learning. I've been doing so much more reading during the first part of this year than last year, and I'm trying to spend about a half hour every day writing down my takeaways from the books that I'm reading, and it just reinforces those takeaways. So I'm not expected to memorize them. I've actually got them written down somewhere, and I can search those notes and pull out those lessons and takeaways when I really need them. Now let's talk about getting ready for your new normal. And I want to go through these 10 steps. So this morning we published this infographic and an article that went with it that explains each of these 10 strategies. And I want to touch on them briefly today. The article is available on the website, so you can certainly take a look at that. And I hope it's helpful. Feel free to share this. You have your own list of 10 resumption and thriving strategies that your organization is pursuing. All right. So number one is what I'm calling reconnect. Reconnect to everyone in your ecosystem. And this is one of several strategies that I'm sharing today that were inspired by a presentation that I attended a couple weeks ago by Brian Moran, who's CEO of a company called the Small Business Edge. And in that presentation, Brian told the audience to reconnect to everyone in our respective ecosystems who's key to achieving our 2020 goals. And for nonprofit organizations, this would include our employees, our volunteers, our vendors, providers, key customers, donors, funders. And he says, first ask, how are you doing? And then ask, whether they're in position to continue working with your organization. So it's a fair question. And what really I've been thinking about a lot about this, that connection as we've been social distancing is really important. It's a bit harder, but it's really important. And it's so necessary to maintain relationships and keep the various teams that we depend on kind of intact and also in sync. And connections, we've learned, are also really important to ease anxiety and be responsive to our communities. And so now we're looking at thoughtful ways to restart and resume services, it's so important that you reconnect with everyone in your ecosystem. All right, let's move on to number two. So number two is drive change. So change has already happened in your organization and more is likely to come. So here's another tip from Brian Moran that helps us get a handle on some of the changes that we need to make to really fortify our organizations. So he suggests that we put all of our plans and projects for 2020 on a table, on a virtual table perhaps, and we sort them into three categories. So the first is plans that were blown up by COVID-19 and its aftermath that are no longer practical, plans that are okay, and plans that are salvageable. So if you take these three categories, if you put all the different projects and programs and things you hope to do and plan to do in 2020 and put them on the table and break them into these categories, you'll find that you've suddenly created a much more manageable list. So with this first category, make sure that you've identified at least one project or one initiative that simply isn't feasible and it no longer makes sense. And some of you may be thinking, well, we have a handful of those, so that's okay as well. Put those in that first category. We really need to take a hard look at what's possible this year and figure out how do we help our teams focus their energies and their enthusiasm and their talents on some new targets and goals and aspirations and some of those must-do projects. So one of the books that I just finished reading is by Margareta Magnusson, and it's called The Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning. And the central message in the book is basically that we should surround ourselves with the things we love and get rid of clutter and possessions that weigh us down and make us less nimble. And in the book, she talks about spending a year getting ready to downsize from living in an apartment or living in a home that had a beautiful garden to living in an apartment. But instead of sadness, she actually finds joy letting go of things that she doesn't really need. And she writes that life will become more pleasant and comfortable if we get rid of some of the abundance. And of course, she's referring to the clutter that complicates our personal lives. But I think many nonprofits are guilty of accumulating goals and activities and offerings until we're basically bursting at the seams. And some of our organizations kind of suffer from programmatic clutter. All right, tip number three or strategy number three is coach your team through change. And this final idea from Brian Moran is to use something he refers to as GPS plans. And as I thought about a GPS, what does a GPS do? It's something that many of us find invaluable and can't imagine traveling without one. But it tells us how long it will take us to get somewhere, um, the mileage to the destination, the actual distance to the destination, how long it will take us to get there, whether there are any detours and traffic jams, which in the best systems is updated as we proceed, and then options, the various routes that we can take to get to that destination. So the concept of GPS is really helpful when you're trying to plan a program or activity. And so what I want to encourage you to do is to create these short GPS plans. There's a 30-day plan, a 60-day plan, and a 90-day plan. And within each of those plans, and this could literally be on one piece of paper, you can have all three plans on one piece of paper, so it doesn't have to be overly complicated. I want you to think about clarifying goals and what are the accountability targets or measures that you're going to be tracking? And then what are the specific steps and strategies? So these kind of mirror what a GPS does, right? The goal is the destination we're trying to get to. The accountability shows us some of the landmarks along the way. And then the steps and strategies are the specific route that we're going to take, the turns, the twists and turns of the journey. So here's a super simple format, and I invite you to be as creative as you want to be with your GPS plans. I would create just a spreadsheet or a Word document that has columns and rows, and I would have my 30-day plan at the top, my 60-day plan at the middle, and 90-day plan at the bottom, right? Goals, targets, steps, and strategies. I think if you simplify some of the planning in your agency and what you're hoping to do in the next 90 days by breaking it down into these three components, you're going to inspire a lot of confidence on your team who are probably feeling a bit overwhelmed about all of the things that need to be caught up on and taken care of as you kind of scramble to resume to as close to normal operations as you can. And please go back to these plans as one pager with these 3 different short plans twice weekly if possible. Just touch base. You want to update these plans as you go, right? So every month you've got a 30-day plan, a 60-day plan, a 90-day plan. So just a suggestion. I hope it feels practical as you move forward into this resumption mode in your organization. So I wanted to just share a cautionary note, and that is to make sure that you're spending time in the clouds, right? That you don't get buried in the weeds. And weeds are things that we see up close. It's the close-up view in our organization. And for some of us, that includes putting out fires. And the fact is, if you're spending a lot of time putting out fires and you're doing that every single day, you're constantly looking down at your feet and you're never looking up, right? And ahead to the future. But when you look kind of up to the clouds or to the distant future, you might be able to see some of the actual problems and challenges you're facing, the root causes of those problems and challenges versus just the impacts, right? So when we're putting out fires and we're looking, keeping our heads down and dealing with just the day to day, we're dealing with impacts, but we're not touching those root causes. And that concept of going upstream is one that's brought home beautifully in Dan Heath's book, which is called Upstream. And it's an excellent read. So if you find your organization is tackling the same problems over and over again, I would encourage you to read Upstream. It might be a book that your leadership team reads together um, and shares and discusses really, really interesting thoughts about figuring out why things are going wrong at an earlier stage of the problem, not when the problems actually materialize, but back when the problem is happening upstream. So my strategy number 4 is to update essential policies. Make sure that your policies are cohesive and not just cobbled together. So for example, you might have some guest and visitor policies that have been on the books for a long time before the pandemic, of course. These probably need to be updated or rewritten to describe when you have some access restrictions in place. And if you have restrictive work from home policies, you might want to retool those as well to make them more comprehensive and to include some flexibility. So other policies I want you to think about include things like temp worker policies, staff travel policies, policies that govern the care of vulnerable clients, and flex time policies for staff who are caregivers for young children or even elderly family members. All right, number 5 is to get your facilities safety ready. So during what many of us are referring to as phase 0 of the pandemic, where you probably have closed some or maybe most or all of your physical offices. So before you bring team members back, I want you to make sure that systems are functioning after being shut down and that your offices are stocked with cleaning supplies. So I hope the list on this slide is helpful as you think about that, kind of running through that checklist, whether your offices are really ready to reopen. And then number 6 is reimagine workspaces. So one of the things that I've noticed in working with lots of different types of nonprofits all around the country is that so many of us have moved to an open floor plan design. Well, that can pose some hurdles for ensuring the health and safety of staff members. And I'm assuming that you're going to try to continue social distancing during this phase 1 or this return to facilities and offices. So, if you've removed walls to create this open floor plan, or if you have a policy where staff hot desk, where they move into small rooms to take phone calls, or if they use huddle rooms that are really small, where people are kind of gathered around a very small table in a very small space, you really need to rethink that configuration. How will that work when you bring people back to the office and you're going to try to encourage some measure of social distancing? So I want you to think about cost-effective strategies and changes. It's unlikely you're going to be able to afford to rebuild those office walls or completely renovate your space. That's impractical for the vast majority of nonprofits. So you have to think about how can we reduce employee density, maybe by having a number of people continue to work from home. Maybe some of those offices that were previously occupied by executive team members could be repurposed, and a large office could accommodate 2 to 3 people still working at a safe distance, and you could move your executive somewhere else, right? And I would also encourage you to consider adding sanitation stations in those communal shared spaces, and make sure you let employees know that we're in this together to keep this office safe and healthy. So we need everybody really pulling their weight. Number 7 is provide resources needed for the job. So, in some cases, employees are more comfortable using a headset. It leads to better call quality and voice quality and sound quality and so forth. And if your staff who are working remotely need that, or they need that now that you're in a different configuration, you really got to find a way to provide that. Also, make sure that if staff left some equipment back at the office and they're transitioning to working at home indefinitely, that you give them time and space to come get those items that will enhance their work from home experience. And I would also encourage you to think about even having a welcome back package that has things like masks and gloves and hand sanitizer. So that's number 7. Number 8 is to put your faith in trusted advisors. And so we're getting bombarded with advice from government officials, from elected officials, from appointed officials. And I just wanted to lift up the idea that I think what we need to do as best we can is to follow the advice of public health officials and recognize that others who are speaking out and giving us advice about when and how it's safe to return to our offices and facilities may have other motivations, right? So I would urge you to turn to those public health officials and those public health resources as your go-to guide. Number 9 is what I'm calling put your team on a pedestal. Many years ago, I read a book called Send, Why People Email So Badly and How to Do It Better. And there was a humorous anecdote in the book, and it was about an executive at Radio Shack who fired 400 workers via email. And the email said, the workforce reduction notification is currently in progress. Unfortunately, your position is one that has been eliminated. So it was a 2-sentence email letting 400 people know they've been fired. And I thought, that's crazy. That wouldn't happen today. And then just this morning, I read a story about Uber employees. 3,500 Uber employees were laid off during a 3-minute Zoom call. This is the opposite of putting your team on a pedestal. So a great rule of thumb about putting your team first is to ask, how would I want to be treated, or how would I want my mother to be treated if her employer were facing a similar set of circumstances? So of course, positions will be eliminated. There will be further layoffs and reductions in force. But I want you to think about, how do I do that as humanely as possible? Would I be okay with a Zoom call where dozens of people were being let go? Or would I prefer a one-on-one conversation with somebody who explains it to me? How hard is that to reach out to every single person who's affected? And some of you may be thinking, well, you can't do that all in one fell swoop and the word will get out. I think people will remember for years and years down the road how you treated them in this moment. So I encourage you to follow that golden rule, to put your employees on a pedestal. And it's so important. Keep in mind that your former employees could be donors, could be board members, could be customers and consumers one day. So the relationship doesn't necessarily end when somebody leaves your organization. So number 10 is be kind and be flexible. From where I sit, those grumpy boss behaviors are out, kindness is in, and it turns out that compassionate leadership brings a lot of positive effects. There was a recent study published by Forbes showing that compassionate leaders see outcomes such as leaps in production and decreased level of stress, increase in a feeling of work-life balance, and really positive emotions about the workplace and about their roles. And a newsletter that I read from time to time is by Gary Burnison of Korn Ferry, and he actually identified vulnerability as one of the most important traits of a CEO. And he said in this piece that vulnerable leaders incite organizational curiosity, creating a culture of collective genius. Rather than people being told what to do, they should be inspired about what to think about. I love that. So in this post-COVID world, this is exactly what I think nonprofit organizations need to do to thrive and really get ready to be successful. During my career, I've been accused a few times of being a bit rigid. I've set rules that, in retrospect, worked really well for me. And I felt that it was my prerogative to set those rules. But during this pandemic, I've come to understand that the policies that work well for my team work best for our mission, right? There's a correlation between what works best for the team and the mission of the organization. So I want to share 3 final tips and takeaways in the last few minutes that we have together. The first one is what I'm calling Seize the Day. And it was inspired by this book called The One Thing by Gary Keller. And I wrote an article called Toss Your To-Do List, which was all about getting rid of those long lists of things to do and really focusing on those one thing, the one thing each and every day that really will make our lives better, make our organizations stronger. And I would encourage you to take a look at your personal and your professional bucket lists or those abandoned to-do lists and try to identify that one thing on those respective lists that if you do that, everything else will be easier or unnecessary. And we're doing that on the team here at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. We do this weekly now where every week we get together and we each share what's the one thing that I want to focus on this week. And that doesn't mean that we aren't still doing lots of other things, but it just signals each other that we have a special thing or a particular thing that we're working on. And it also signals members of the team that this is the thing that we're probably going to need help on. So it's a great way to just show that we're focusing. It's not about who has the longest to-do list. It's about really making an impact in our communities. And then the second tip that I wanted to share is what I'm calling Lead Like an Introvert. I read a really interesting article this morning called Why Introvert Leaders Excel During a Crisis. And there were a couple of takeaways from that article. One is that, I think those of us who are extroverts sometimes feel that, leadership is about giving direction, inspiring people by telling them what to do or asking them to do things. But what the author of this article says is that navigating challenges and overcoming difficult periods um, really requires that the people who you ask to take action do something, right? That it's the actual implementation of those actions that is more important than the brilliance of the suggestion or the action. So you really want to figure out a way to focus on the people taking action rather than trying to just um, fine tune and refine your own thinking. So another tip is to ask more questions. And the author writes that, introverts tend to ask more questions than give direction or give answers, right? So she suggests that in your prep time for a staff meeting, for a team meeting, spend most of it coming up with questions you're going to ask the team, not the speech you're going to give the team, right? So focus on the questions and not what the answers that you think you have and you want to share. That's really just fascinating to me. And I'm resolving to do this for my next staff meeting. And then she also says, don't ask questions that are answers in disguise. And I love the example she gives, which is, have you tried rebooting, right? It sounds like a question, but it's really a directive. Reboot. Try that first. And then she reminds us that in any team meeting, we should try to ask everybody to participate. And sometimes the introverts won't participate unless they're called on. So one of my favorite techniques for both board meetings and staff meetings is to go around the virtual table and ask everybody to participate, ask everybody what they think, and draw them into the conversation. So my last tip is to try to peer into the future. I would encourage you to look at your organization through the eyes of a startup and try to reimagine the future of your organization. And this might mean reevaluating your mission and how it impacts your community. It might also mean making some bold directional challenges or rethinking what are our top 3 priorities for this year. And I want to encourage you to take time to reflect on change that's necessary to really survive and thrive in this post-COVID world. The questions on this particular slide are inspired by the concept of envisioning a utopia, which is a technique that was featured in another book that I've been reading recently. It's called Create the Future in the Innovation Handbook, Tactics for Disruptive Thinking. So the authors of that book encourage us to think about what's the future we envision? What 5 factors will shape that future? And then what bold risks must we embrace today to get there? I hope this has been helpful as you think about resumption strategies. I hope that list of 10 strategies is helpful and inspiring in some ways. I encourage you to take a look at that full article, share it if you want to. And again, I want to thank the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits for inviting me to deliver this series of programs. And also I want to thank Duke Energy for providing funding for this. So thank you so much, everybody. I wish you all the best in your resumption strategies. And please reach out if I can be helpful in any way, answer any specific questions that you're facing and grappling with. I would be more than happy to do my best to answer those questions. So thank you so much, everybody.